Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. This is one of my favorite episodes to record all year. And today's episode is all about the best books that I read in 2021. I've mentioned it before, but my part of my personal growth plan to ensure that I'm staying on track and consistent with my growth is that I commit to reading 50 nonfiction books every year. And I've done that for the past several years. And I find that just having that number, of course, we always want to be focused on being growth conscious and not just goal conscious. But I find that having a set number of books that I want to commit to reading every single year helps me just be intentional about staying on task with what am I reading? What have I read so far this year? What am I learning? How am I growing? And that's really the only qualifiers. It just has to be nonfiction. I read quite a lot of fiction books as well, but I commit to at least 50 nonfiction books every year. And these could be biographies, they're personal growth books. It's a huge variety because my interests are varied and I'm always learning. And I find that I can learn something from just about any good nonfiction book, whether it's a biography or a memoir of somebody who's overcome something, some story. I let it read a lot of history, a lot of examples like that, and of course the self leadership or the personal growth as well as leadership of others. So a huge variety there, and I find that it really broadens my mindset, my thinking. So when I think of that for some people that's a big number, and I realize that. And I'm not trying to tell you that you should commit to reading 50 nonfiction books every year. That's just where I find my number to be in terms of my personal growth and development. Now, the thing about that is I absolutely love to read. Not and there again, I said earlier, not only do I read these nonfiction books, but I also just have a random number of fiction books that I read throughout the year as well. And obviously, those are a little more lighter reading, maybe recreational reading versus learning from them. But I find that I really enjoy the nonfiction books, perhaps more even these days. So, some of the best books that I read in 2021, I always have to throw out this disclaimer: best is very subjective, right? Particularly when it comes to the best books that I read this year. Best could mean different things to different people, but when I say the best books I read this year, I mean either best in terms of inspiring me or influencing me, helping me grow in my personal development, or perhaps changing the way I perceive something, right? Changing my mindset or my level of awareness relative to myself or how the world works. And so, a little bit of qualifier, some of that best definition obviously is just where I'm at in my journey that year. So if I were to go back and read one of these books in future years, it might resonate with me at a different level because of where I was in my journey. Right. So that is a little bit subjective. It's kind of like you read the Bible one time and then you go back through a different season of your life and you read it again and you're like, wow, this is just so much. I see this so much differently, or perhaps it has more meaning for me in this season of my life than it did when you first read it. And so it's a little bit like that. So there again, best could be very subjective, and there is no relative scale when it comes to best. It really just is, where am I at in my journey and how is this resonating with me? So the first book I wanted to talk about in this podcast is The 5 Levels of Attachment, Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And I've mentioned this book on a podcast before because it really, really was powerful in terms of helping me articulate or helping me speak to how we as people form some sense of our identity around external things or roles that we see ourselves in life. So he uses the example of a sports analogy, which I think is really powerful. A lot of people can relate to that in terms of a healthy level of attachment to being a sports fan of a particular team is level 1 or 2. You might could go to a game and you're really not attached to your sense of identity as a fan. Like maybe you don't even know the two teams playing, but you're cheering for one or the other based on some arbitrary number. Maybe you know somebody who knows somebody who's a fan, or maybe one team's wearing red jerseys, and so you say, "Oh, I'll pull for the red team," right? But win or lose, the outcome doesn't affect you emotionally because you don't have any high level of attachment to yourself, your sense of identity as a fan of one particular sports team. So that's all well and good, but he talks about level 3, eh, a level of attachment, it starts to change a little bit, right? At level 3 level of attachment, I call myself a football fan of a specific football team, right? And so maybe I wear the shirts and the jerseys or the hats, or I collect memorabilia, like to go to the games. And when that team loses, man, it just really affects me emotionally at some level because I have a higher level of attachment to my sense of identity as a sports fan for that particular football team. And then level 4 and 5 even take that to a more extreme level, right? Level 4 and 5, level of attachment to my sense of identity as a sports fan, is an unhealthy level of attachment because at this level, my sense of identity is so wrapped up in this sense of identity as a sports fan that when the team loses, like, man, I don't just have a bad day. I have like a bad weekend. I am mad on Monday morning because my team lost, or I get frustrated at the outcome of the game because the referee made a bad call on us. So you start to see how when I adopt that or create my sense of identity around a sports fan of a particular football team, then the outcome can start to affect my life in a very unhealthy and negative way because I don't really have any control over whether the football team wins or loses, right? But I absolutely have control of how I respond to that. And when I create an unhealthy level of attachment, then I start to choose to respond to the outcome of that football game in a very negative way. And maybe that affects my relationships, my family, that can just ooze out into different facets of our life. So we kind of understand that from a sports attachment analogy. But if you apply that same concept to a sense of identity as a religious belief or religious identity, or a lifestyle choice, such as being vegan or something like that. So someone asked me the other day if I was vegan, and I said no. I try to make sure that I eat most of the foods I eat as a whole food, plant-based lifestyle, but I don't like the label of being vegan because I don't want to wrap some sense of my identity and be attached to that label, that lifestyle choice, or what that might mean. Because at the end of the day, I'm still going to have a bowl of ice cream at some point, and I don't want to create an identity as a vegan and then I would start to self-criticize or self-judge if I want that bowl of ice cream occasionally. So that's the reason I think it's healthy to look at our different roles that we create for ourselves, and the sense of identity that we create, and how attached are we to different facets of that. For example, you might choose a healthy or an unhealthy level of attachment to your role in your career. And then if you have an unhealthy level of attachment when you retire, suddenly your life is meaningless. Or you might have an unhealthy attachment to a relationship and your role in that relationship, but then the relationship breaks up, and so now you found that your center inside yourself is just completely lost, right? So you see how this could play out in so many different levels and different ways in our lives. So it really was an insightful book. I highly recommend it for that perspective of self-awareness and self levels of attachment. Okay, so the next book that I really enjoyed this year, or one of the ones that I would say is the best, How Not to Die by Michael Greger, Dr. Michael Greger. The interesting thing about this book was the title fascinated me because how not to die, you would think that was a subject that all of us would be interested in, right? If we are human, we are at some level interested in how not to die. So it was interesting that he titled a book that, but the book was really all about how not to die from specific diseases based on lifestyle choices. So, for example, he talked about the power of nutrition and flax seeds, ground flax seeds, and how ground flax seeds, like 1 teaspoon a day, could help you fight different so many different types of cancers. So just by being proactive and saying, I'm going to have 1 teaspoon of ground flax seeds a day, helps increase your nutrition and boost your nutrition to the point that you minimize or almost eliminate your risk to so many different types of cancer. And he goes through that with a lot of different things, like how not to die from breast cancer. And then he talks about the foods that you should avoid and the foods that you could include in your diet to minimize your risk. And he talks about how not to die from heart disease, how not to die from diabetes. So it really helped me understand the direct correlation between eating and what we eat and how that minimizes or maximizes our risk from certain lifestyle diseases. And so it definitely made me be more just intentional. I've tried to eat the majority of foods that I eat as healthy, whole foods, mostly plant-based. But it really raised my level of awareness and intentionality to a new level when I saw that direct correlation between include this, and here's why. Don't include this, and here's why. So it was an interesting book from that perspective. It did get a little redundant toward the end because you're at some point, the same foods and food groups start to show up. The ones that you probably already know are healthy for you and are pretty much going to help minimize your risks for certain lifestyle diseases, and they might show up multiple times in the book. But that was just, probably because I sit down and I read books like that in 1 or 2 settings. And so it did kind of just start to become a little redundant toward the end. But that's just me. And there again, seeing the same food groups over and over for the same reasons, but different lifestyle diseases. But overall, very, very powerful book. Dr. Greger later, after he wrote the book, came up with the concept of the daily dozen, foods that you could include every single day that would help minimize your risk for so many lifestyle diseases. And he has a free app that you can download. I'm sure it's for Android, but I know it's for iPhone as well, that you can find in the App Store, called the Daily Dozen. And it's just a cool app because it lets you just go through really simple. And so, for example, he recommends 3 servings of fruit every day. And so it has 3 little boxes. And so as you go through the day, you can check off, yep, I've had 1 fruit, I've had 2 fruits, I've had 3 fruits, and then it'll cross it out for you. So it's a very visual, very simple dashboard that really helps you eat intentionally and healthfully without having to put a whole lot of thought into it. So I'm a big fan of don't reinvent the wheel if you're already in driving a cart down the road, right? There's no need. Third book that I really wanted to just touch on in this list, excuse me, I read Matthew McConaughey's book Green Lights, and it was surprisingly in depth in terms of introspective and his growth journey, and it surprised me a little bit. It was a good, easy read. I learned a lot, certainly about his journey and growth over the years and perspective on things. It's written in a very frank style. So as he talks is how you're going to read it in the book, including a couple of words of profanity, which I don't particularly like or enjoy, but I appreciate just the authenticity, I think, of acknowledging that on the front end. But it was a neat book, and I learned a lot. And there again, it surprised me the depth of insight and awareness. There was a lot of good growth perspectives, and his whole thing about red lights in your life and green lights, and really good, insightful memoir that talked about how we as individuals can be focused on growth and how we should notice when things in our life aren't going well and pay attention to when they are going well, things like that. I really enjoyed my friend Sarah Claudia's book, Unseen Steps. She has just recently released this book. And if you've heard me talk about Sarah Claudia, she's been a guest on the Fearfully and Wonderfully Me podcast. And, her story just touches me in so many ways. She inspires me. And so it was neat to get to see, to read her book of her story, of her journey from actually being a college student and then going through a surgery with complications that nobody could have expected, and then just waking up being completely blind and deaf in one ear. And so, sometimes that's a hard thing, to read somebody's story of a tragedy in their life. But the inspiring thing is learning how they've turned it into a triumph, right? And I think that's the lesson. That's why I love reading biographies or autobiographies and memoirs, because absolutely the hardship and the adversity is it's tough to read sometimes, but isn't that a wonderful thing when we can turn that into something good? And Sarah Claudia is definitely using her story um, in the lives of other people. So really good. If you haven't, for some reason, haven't listened to that podcast episode recently where she was a guest um, on this podcast, you can go back and catch that episode. That was released on November 23rd, so it hasn't been that long. So certainly go back and catch that if you want to learn more about Sarah Claudia and where to find her book. I just recently finished, and this was one I just read in the last week or so, Rudolph, and I hope I'm saying the last name right, Verba, VRBA. And the name of the book is How I Escaped from Auschwitz. And it was one of the more impactful books that I've read about Auschwitz and the just the trials of going through that and living through that experience as a survivor, clearly. And it was more detailed than some of the ones that I've read, and more comprehensive than a lot of the books I've read. And I think a lot of that was his particular attention to detail, because he shares the story in the book, of course, of how he ended up being imprisoned in the concentration camp. But almost from the very beginning, he was thinking about, how can I escape? But not with the intention of, how do I escape just because I don't want to be here, but with the intention of, I want to escape so that I can go tell the world how terrible this place is, how awful, what's really going on here. And so because he had that mindset, he paid so much more attention to details and things like that, because from the very beginning, he had the mindset of, I need to tell the world about these horrible tragedies and help stop other people from being imprisoned here, because the world doesn't know what's going on. And, he at the time was thinking a lot of these people, particularly the Jews, told they were being relocated. And so they were willingly, getting on a train with a bag, and they had no idea they were actually headed to a concentration camp. So there again, that's one of those books that it's tough to read in places because it is a little bit emotional. But I think it's important to learn, as we talk about learning the lessons of history. And for me, that was one of the better books that really talked about the depths of suffering of what went on in the concentration camps. So um, one of those books that really makes you think and raises that level of awareness. Okay. And then last but not least, I read a really good book on leadership and culture of leadership in an organization called The Carrot Principle. Adrian Gostick and Chester Elton wrote this book, and I've been a fan of theirs for many, many, many years. I don't even know. I think it was probably early 2008 or later in the year 2008. Someone gave me a copy of their book, A Carrot a Day. And it was like 365 ways to reward or recognize team members. And it just had some really good ideas or thoughts on how you could recognize team members and show appreciation as their leader. And so I've been a fan of theirs, the authors, for ever since I read that book, just because it was very practical, good book. So when I stumbled on their book, The Carrot Principle, I was so excited to read it, and it really was good. I had some good insights on why we as leaders, or even as people, need to make sure that we're showing appreciation, expressing that, recognizing if we're in a formal leadership role, we need to be expressing appreciation and recognizing team members for the little things and the big things, and how that translated into a culture that made people want to work there. And Mac and I talk about a lot of times when we're talking about leadership is organizations should have the mindset that they want to be an employer of choice, right? They want to be attracting top talent, the best and the brightest, to come work in their organization, because it's a whole lot easier to be the type of organization that it's attracting great people, instead of an organization that at best is not attracting great people and you have to go look for them, but perhaps at worst you're driving away people with great values that are top talent driven, great leaders who want to work in the organization, they're looking for a great organization, right? And so high impact people are looking for a high impact team to be members of. And so there again, I really got a lot of great nuggets and great quotes from the Carrot Principle, talking about culture and leadership. If you are a leader, formal level leader in an organization, I highly recommend that. It definitely makes you think when you see that there's actually really valid research behind what we already know is true, is that, being a great leader and taking that responsibility on, it's difficult to measure ROI necessarily, or the bottom line, until you start to see some of the research that shows how you as a leader are affecting the organizational culture, your team's behaviors, your team's productivity, your team's morale, your teamwork within the organization, and it starts to quantify how important great leadership is in an organization. So there you have it. My top best quote unquote books for 2021. I have already started compiling my list of books that I want to read for 2022. So that will be coming, of course, next year. So really excited to just learn. It's interesting, when I first started just writing down the names of the books that I read, I realized that number one, I started being more intentional about the books I read, and choosing what would go on the list, in a little more higher level of intention. But I also find that I retain the lessons better because, when I finish a book and I stop and I put it on my list, I stop to think about, what did I really learn from this book? Why did it interest me? Why would I talk about it on a podcast, at the end of the year? What would make it interesting to somebody else? If I was describing it to them. And so I find that I retain what I'm reading at a much higher level. And so that's always exciting, because the whole point of learning and growing to begin with is to actually retain it and then do something with it. Because if you don't do anything with what you're learning, then you might as well not be learning, right? Until next time.